So we're trying to identify faith, and I've been saying it every single time we started at faith. I've just left it on the board at this point. The author is trying to identify faith as a believing response to God's revealed word that is going to lead to some sort of action. And so the author has an audience of believers way back about 60 AD or so. And these believers are struggling for whatever reason. They're starting to fail to congregate together. They've got groups that aren't congregating at all. They have certain people that are refusing to mature in their Christian walk. And you've got the sense that he's writing to a group of people that are just afraid. You've got a group of people that are looking around them. They're saying things that are operating against them, or that might operate against them. They're reading the tea leaves, they're looking in the future, like things are going to get bad. And our only way of survival seems to be, let's withdraw within ourselves. Let's not contact outside. Let's just kind of withdraw and wait for things to blow on by. And then, whatever happens after that, we can deal with. And the author's confronting them with that, going, no, it doesn't matter what is going on. Your goal is to keep your mind focused upon Christ. You're supposed to continue to grow and mature spiritually. You're supposed to continue to do all the things that God wants you to do here, rather than this choice that you've made to kind of withdraw and stagnate. And so to buttress his argument here, he's giving a list, chapter 11, of a whole bunch of people from the beginning of Genesis all the way through really the Maccabean period, as I've been studying out, which I think is really interesting. But he's got a whole list of history where he's cherry-picking different people and saying, hey, look at what God did with these people. This person interacted with some promise God made to them, and they responded in faith, and look at how it turned out. And what he's saying, some of them, it turned out great. Like Enoch didn't even die. He got to go straight to heaven. Abraham, on the other hand, got to wander around like a pilgrim in a land that he owned but didn't own, and then die with one son and a cave to his name. And then every single instance of them, really, is they had to endure mockery and suffering and persecution. Almost all of them did. And so what the author is trying to get his point at is, it doesn't matter what actually happens to us when we're living here. It doesn't matter whether life is going well or life is going poorly. You can't judge your life of faithfulness based off of the circumstances around you. And so a life of faithfulness is going to be that which pleases God. So you interact with God's word, you understand what God has said, you respond to that and believe in it and follow it, which leads to the action in your life. And no matter what's going on around you, as long as you continue living that way, that's the kind of faith that pleases God. Because that faith understands two things. One, it understands that God exists. Obviously, you have to believe that God is there before you're going to serve him. Otherwise, I don't know of anyone that serves a God they think doesn't exist, if that makes sense. You have to believe God's there. You also have to believe God is faithful. His faithfulness involves, he makes promises. His promises involve some sort of reward. And you serve God, he's going to reward you with those promises. And what we're looking forward to is Christ coming back. Excuse me. And so we've got this promise. I'll write it on the board here because I don't know why I erased it. So we've got this promise God has made for us. The promise is not here. I cannot see what God has done. I don't know what it's going to look like. But what I can do, because I can do what the author is doing, is looking all the way back through the Old Testament and say, hey, here's this guy. Here's the promise he had, and here's what he responded to God. This is what God did for him. And we can see in every single instance, God keeping and fulfilling his word all throughout it, which should give people like us confidence, because God hasn't changed, right? You all are like frozen this morning. God hasn't changed. You're like, not a trick question. Yeah, brains are frozen. God hasn't changed. So if in the Old Testament God has made promises and fulfilled them like he said he would, then we could extrapolate from that. If God hasn't changed and God still has promises that are yet unfulfilled, that he's eventually going to get to fulfilling them. And that should give us hope today, because we know in the future God's going to take care of all the things he said he's going to take care of. And so what the author is doing is trying to get his audience to understand that and get their minds, and this is going to sound trite, and don't take it too far, but get their minds off of their present circumstances and get it focused on God. Now, practically, you can't get your mind off of present circumstances. We understand that. So I'm not saying just ignore all of these things and pretend they're magically going to solve themselves while I have my mind focused on God. I'm just saying your concern and your fear should be towards God rather than towards the circumstances. Excuse me. So last week we left off with Abraham, and this week we're going to pick back up with Abraham. Different people divide this differently. Some people say verse 16 is the end of one section, 17 begins the other. Some people say the start of Abraham begins one, the end of Abraham begins the other. Honestly, it's fine either way. It's not good. It doesn't change the overall argument of how the author is working his way through this. So we're going to start in verses 17 through 22, and we're going to shift really from Abraham getting into the land of promise to what Abraham does when he is in there. So up to verse 16, we've talked about Abraham coming out of Ur, going into the land of Israel, wandering around, and now we're going to shift kind of from Abraham towards Isaac, and then Jacob, and then Joseph. And so we have to talk about Abraham here. So verse 17, if I can find it on the other page. Verse 17, by faith, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from whence he also received him in a figure. So I want to highlight a particular tension. This is something I didn't notice until last week in the afternoon. And so you have this tension between what seems physically impossible versus what God's promise or command is. Does that make sense? Like, there's an inherent tension. For example, with Isaac. So Abraham is told to offer up Isaac on the Mount of Moriah, offer him up for a burnt sacrifice. In other words, kill your own son. Just to put it completely blunt. Kill your own son. So the problem is, Isaac is the son of promise, right? And so God made a covenant with Abraham, and God says that covenant is going to go through Isaac. And this covenant involves Abraham's descendants multiplying like the stars of the ocean, stars of the sky, and the sands of the sands of whatever. You know what I mean? I don't speak properly, so. And so, if Isaac is dead, how can God fulfill his promise?
He can't.
He can't. So that's physically impossible, right? So if Isaac is dead, then this can't happen. Fair? Okay. So when you are faced with this tension, what should you do? How do you reconcile this? Because some people, and this is going to be another trait, say I'm full of trait sayings this morning, that just have faith, right? Just have faith. That doesn't make any sense. Like, there's going to be some other things we talk about that just don't make sense. And so the thinking is, if Isaac is alive, well, Isaac will have kids, and God will continue to fulfill his promise. Ultimately, the fulfillment of Abraham's promise is in Christ. And these shall nations be blessed, referring to the Messiah that is coming. But that can't happen if Isaac's dead. But God says, offer your son. Huh? He could have another son, sure, but Isaac was the son of promise. God's not going to go, well, Isaac was the son of promise, but now you killed him, so I have to bring somebody else. Whoops. Should have thought about that before I told you to do it. I mean, that's not what's going on. Like, God doesn't have oopsies. He doesn't have do-overs like, well, I better do something else here. I made a mistake. Like, God doesn't make mistakes. And so what we have here is a really interesting picture of Abraham. Okay, you'll find in verse... Why do I keep turning the page? I'm not on this page yet. You'll find in verse 19 the word accounting. And so the word accounting is a word that means calculate. And so what we have here is Abraham's thinking. Okay, so Isaac is where all the promises are going to be fulfilled through Isaac. If Isaac is dead, God can't fulfill his promises. So there's going to be some way where even though God has told me to do this, that God is still going to fulfill his promises. And we all know that if Isaac is dead, promises are impossible. Therefore, Isaac must be alive for the promises to be fulfilled, correct? Therefore, the logical conclusion is what? Huh?
God raises him.
Right. So Abraham, and he's reasoning this out. Like, God didn't tell him this is what I'm going to do. As far as we know. He just goes. Mm-hmm. He doesn't tell him, hey, I'm just going to raise him from the dead. He doesn't tell him anything. Just go offer your son. Abraham's like, okay. And so in the 3 days he takes to travel, he's reasoning all this in his mind. He's like, wait a minute. God can't break a promise. So when you're faced with two impossible things, which is physically impossible, and two, the impossibility of God breaking a promise, Abraham's like, this overrides that.
Yep.
So God's ability to fulfill his promise overrides anything that we see as physically impossible. Now the question I have for you is, does Abraham have warrant in his life for believing that? And what is that warrant, if so?
I mean, God's fulfilled all of his promises to Abraham up
Right.
to this point.
Mm-hmm.
He literally just had a kid at 100
Right.
years old, so.
After he and his wife both viewed their bodies as what? Dead. Yeah, they already thought they were dead and they had a kid. And so Abraham at some point realizes that death is not a barrier to God. Like, this does not stop God whatsoever. Physically impossible things are no problem for God at all. Because God is not bound by the same laws we are bound by. And so Abraham, rather than acting in doubt or acting in fear or faithlessness, just gets up and goes. And at some point in time has reasoned his way into, even if I do offer Isaac, he's going to be alive, which is why he says, stay here, and when we go up to the mount, we will come back down. So he's already expecting Isaac's coming back with him. And so at that point, he's already understanding, hey, even if I kill Isaac, God has to raise him from the dead to fulfill his promise, and that is no problem with God whatsoever, which is really a powerful demonstration of faith if you think about it, because how many of you would take your son, if you have a son, and go do that? Seriously, think about that. Our kid's not born yet, and I don't want to do that. Like, that's powerful. And so people will accuse us of fideism. Am I saying that right? I'll spell it. I don't know if I listened to it yesterday and I already forgot how to pronounce it. How do I spell it? Fideism? Huh?
Fideism?
I think it's fideism, yeah. Does anyone know what that is? Huh?
Does it have to do with faith?
Yeah, it does. So a fideism is the idea, it's a term or a name of a standpoint. Okay, I'm going to give you the technical definition, and then your eyes will glaze over and then I'll explain it. Fideism is a term used to name a standpoint in epistemological theory that maintains that faith is independent of reason, or that reason and faith are hostile to each other, and faith is superior to arriving at particular truths.
False.
Yeah, so faith and reason are contradictory, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would be accused, because we have faith in God, of a fideism, because we have no reason to back it up, so to speak. That's a fideism, faith without reason. Now, is Abraham guilty of this? Well, no, he's not guilty of this, because he has a whole bunch of empirical data that proves to him that God's completely able to do whatever God says he wants to do. Therefore, his faith is not a fideism. And we have the exact same thing, because we have all the data in the scriptures that tell us this is how God operates, this is what God has done. And if we believe in a God that can raise Christ from the dead, and Christ bore all of our sins, what else could God not do? Like, nothing else is going to stop him from fulfilling his promises. Nothing can. And so it's not necessarily fideism. We have reason and warrant to believe what we believe.
This is another argument against those that, we know personally plenty of people that would fall into that category of fideism, because it's like, well, just have faith, and it's like, no, what you're doing is illogical.
Right.
Like, you're just claiming that it's faith.
Right.
It's not.
Right. I'm just saying faith and reason go together. They're not mutually exclusive things. Mm-hmm. And so it says Abraham received Isaac in a figure. And so that, nobody knows what that means, because all the commentators are like, this is a very difficult thing to interpret, and then they interpret in all different ways. So I'm just going to go on a limb and say nobody's quite sure what that means. But the basic gist of it, if you look up the words offered, it's listed twice, Abraham offered and when he had offered. The first offered, there's in a perfect tense indicating Abraham's complete obedience to the command to offer up his son. And so as far as Abraham's standpoint goes, the deed had already been done. The second word is in a different tense that indicates the actual physical act had not happened yet, which we know because God stopped it. And so because of Abraham's complete and total obedience, Isaac was already as good as dead. So figuratively speaking, Isaac was raised back from the dead in his mind. And so this points to a future resurrection, it's interestingly enough. Like, we tend to read back and look on this and read a whole bunch of Christological symbolism and everything in the Old Testament. And it's not, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I just think if you do that too much, you're going to skew the interpretation of what's going on. But you could actually read the belief in a future resurrection through this, because he's already understanding even if Isaac's dead, he's going to be alive again. And so it's really interesting to see how they believe certain things. And that basically is Abraham. The next group's a little bit different. So we're going to get into Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, of all things. And so he doesn't follow the Christological line. He ignores Judah completely and relies on Joseph instead. And he highlights Isaac and Jacob. But you could go back and read Genesis, and those two were not necessarily exemplars of the faith, so to speak. Like, they had issues. Like, they had some serious issues. And the author still chooses to highlight them. And so the author says, if I can find it here, there we are. He says, verse 20 through 22, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on top of his staff. And by faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the parting of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. All right, so all three of these have one thing in common. Can you see it?
By faith.
Well, yeah, everything in here is by faith.
They have a future-looking aspect.
Exactly. So what was the promise God made to them?
Land.
Land. And at least in Jacob and Joseph's case, they're in Egypt.
Yeah.
With Isaac's case, and it's really interesting that he picks Isaac here, because if you go back and look at Isaac, is mostly concerned about his stomach at this point. Because he's like, Esau, I'm about to die. You know, go out into the field, kill some venison, give me some venison, that way I can eat and bless you before I die. All Isaac cares about is his stomach at this point. If you read it, that's all he's caring about. It's food. I'm about to die. You're my firstborn. Go get some food. I'll eat it. I'll feel good, and I'll bless you. And Jacob's not any better, because Jacob's like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to get the birthright. And his mom hatches his plan so Jacob could go in and deceive his dad to get it. None of that needed to happen. But at the same time, the fact that Isaac was blessing Jacob and Esau concerning the future showcases at least some part of faith that he had. And that's what the author is trying to highlight here. Because in the blessing, God is passing down his covenant promise through the generations, right? And so they're looking ahead to the ultimate fulfillment of that promise. And in that, and in their blessing, at least when he blesses Jacob, Isaac blessing Jacob, when he finally blesses Jacob, he gives him the blessing of Abraham, instead of being worried about his stomach. They're looking ahead to this future plan that God has promised. They're like, hey, God has promised us this is not yet fulfilled, but just because I am dying doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. And so the blessing is somehow connected to the promise. So these things overlap a little bit. Now, the faith aspect comes in the point that Isaac had absolutely no power whatsoever to enact the blessing. Does that make sense? Like, he can speak a blessing on his descendants, but he has no power to make it actually happen. But he has faith because God has made a promise. When he passes on the blessing, God had already said it should go to Jacob anyways. But he has faith because he made the promise. It's in line with, or he makes the blessing, it's in line with what God has promised, that God is ultimately going to bring that to pass. And so this highlights this future aspect of faith. Even though the promise is not yet fulfilled in my lifetime, I know God is eventually going to get to it. That's in God's control. I have ultimate confidence that that's what he is going to do. And so you see the same theme passing down. So with Isaac, it's blessing Jacob and Esau. When it gets to Jacob, he's talking about Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And at this point, they're in Egypt. They know they're going to be in Egypt for 400 years, because that's what God told Abraham. And yet Jacob is blessing Joseph's sons and saying, hey, these two are going to become great when they're back in the land. Like, they're going to multiply and they're going to be great people in the land. So he's thinking 400 years later, at least. And he's about to die. And so he passes the blessing on. Does that make sense? And then Joseph finishes this little trifecta of people that are about to die and says, hey, you can read this like the last verse of Genesis. When I'm dead, when you guys get out of the land, bring my bones back to Israel and bury me there. So even though I am dead, God is still going to fulfill his promise to you. When he does, bring me back. Because Egypt is not where I'm supposed to be. The promised land is up there. So when I'm dead, bring my bones back. And then, of course, when the Exodus happens, that's exactly what they do. They bring his bones back. And so you see all of them are evidencing this faith, and they're seeing this promise afar off, like it says earlier in the chapter. And having faith in that promise makes it seem real today, if that makes sense. And so because it's real today, I'm about to die, let me pass on the blessing to the next person, and then pass on the blessing to the next person, and so forth and so on. And so that's why he's highlighting those three people, because he's showing how faith in God is going to lead you to being concerned about God's promise, even up to the point of death. And then we move on to Moses, and we'll have a little bit of time to cover this. We're going to start with Moses' parents, because it's where he starts with. And so Moses is born at a time where you have a king, you have Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, I'm tired of the Israelites multiplying. If anything actually happens, they're going to rise up with anyone that attacks us, or we're going to get overthrown. And so we're going to enslave the whole lot of them. But the more he persecuted them and the more they afflicted, the more God blessed them, the more they spread. And so he's like, okay, well, I got to stop this. So he says, every male that's born needs to die. So just kill them all. If they're born, kill them. And so Moses' parents have Moses at this time. And so they have a conflict, right? Conflict. So they have king's command. Versus God's command. Now, they didn't have the entire law at this point, so I understand that, but they have this idea where Pharaoh says, we need to kill all the males. Moses is born, right? And so they have this baby, and the baby is a goodly child. And the word means beautiful, but I don't think it's saying, oh, wow, this kid's beautiful, so we're just going to keep him alive. Every parent thinks their kid's the most beautiful, adorable, cutest thing in the world. And most babies are ugly.
Except the peanut.
Every parent thinks their kid is the most beautiful, adorable thing in the world. And so there's a little bit more going on to, oh, wow, this child's beautiful. We better not, follow the Pharaoh's commandment. The word beautiful or goodly is only used twice, and both times it's used for Moses. Stephen also uses it in Acts chapter 7 when he's talking about Moses being a proper child. And so the word beautiful means like genteel. And so you have this idea of somebody that is made for like the courts or nobility, or somebody that has, how did I write this down? Let me read what I wrote down. It makes more sense. Yeah, it means of the city, somebody who's polished. And so Moses comes along, he's a baby, and they see something in him that makes them believe that God has destined him for greatness. And so they have this idea. They say, okay, well, we believe God has destined our kid for greatness because of something they see in him. And Pharaoh says, kill him. So what do? This is pretty powerful. You have the ruler of the entire land that could kill you just by ordering it. Versus, do I save my life and get rid of my son, or do I not fear for my life at all and fear God over what the king says? And that's a theme that's going to be common through this entire part talking about Moses. And so obviously we know what happens. Moses survives, and they hide him for 3 months. Then they put him in bulrushes, put him in the river. Pharaoh's daughter finds him, and Pharaoh's daughter falls in love with him too. And says, oh, look at him, he's such a proper child, and raises him up in the courts, right? And so the first part of Moses' faith is actually his parents, which is, I am not going to fear what Pharaoh says over what God commands. And so you have this tension between, do I follow what the king says or do I follow what God says? If they're in contradiction, obviously you should follow what God says, but you can't make light of these situations. You can't just, it's easy for us to go back and look at these things and say, oh yeah, well, the answer is obvious. They're in danger of their lives. This is not a trivial decision for them. They're in danger of their lives. And yet their faith is evidenced in overcoming their fear of the king's commandment because they fear God instead. And that theme actually continues on. So this divides Moses' life in like 40-year segments. So we divide Moses from year birth to 40 as he's growing up as the daughter of Pharaoh, or son of Pharaoh, sorry. Son of Pharaoh. And then he flees for 40 years, and then he comes back for the last 40 years of his life, delivers Israel, and they wander around for 40 years until everyone dies. And so the first 40 years, he's brought up as the son of Pharaoh, which my reading indicates that he might have been next in line for the throne. Like that whole idea of the son of Pharaoh's daughter indicates that he's royalty. He is somebody that he's in the succession for the throne. So he has everything going for him. Right? He's like a super rich politician of the day. Like when his daddy dies, he's next. He gets to rule the entire country. And Moses gives all of that up. So all of the learning, all of the peace, all of the security, all of the wealth he has, all of it. And he just gives it up. Because he values identifying himself with the people of God over identifying himself as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's crazy. And here's the thought process. Because you're like, well, no, it's not crazy, but you already know how it played out. He doesn't know how it's going to play out. We already know the end. It's easy to understand that's, it's the most logical thing in the world because we know how it plays out, we know how it ends. But if you're right there, that's nuts. Think of it this way. If Moses ended up becoming the next Pharaoh, don't you think he could have freed the Israelites that way? Right? And so logically speaking, from a human perspective, he has more to gain just staying as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, because he could have some kind of court influence to help relieve the burden and pressure of his people and eventually set them free. But that's not how he's even thinking. He gives all of that up, every last bit of it, to lead a group of whiny, rebellious, stubborn people for 40 years. A life of luxury, a life of wealth, a life of affluence, everything. He gives all of that up for the cause of Christ, it says. And he's willing to suffer reproach with the people. And the reason for that is he's looking at the wealth of Egypt in one hand, and he's looking at the reproach of Christ. He says, this is a greater rich and greater value than everything Egypt has to offer. Which is kind of an interesting little contradiction, because nobody seems to think of affliction and reproach as something of greater value than wealth. That's not how we're trained to think. And yet that's exactly what he does. And so the reason why is verse 26 is because he had respected the recompense of reward. So this ties all the way back to verse 6 for God's reward, and then we're going to have to finish because it's time to go. But remember verse 6, it says God is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. And here Moses in 26 has respected the recompense of the reward. So he understands from the 3 years or however long he was with his mom at least, he understood even at that point that God is going to fulfill his promises. God has a reward in the land in this case. God is going to fulfill those things. I have more respect for what God said and what God has promised than all the wealth that Egypt has available to it. And so he's valuing that over Egypt. And we're going to get into the rest of it next week because we have to stop. But the question I want to ask you, it says that by faith Moses, let's see, verse 27, I believe. No, that's the wrong chapter. Where's chapter 11? There's chapter 11. So by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Was that his first flight from Egypt or their second flight from Egypt? By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Is that his first leaving or his second?
Oh, first.
Okay, so think about that for next week. There's a little bit of a contradiction either way. The first contradiction, if you look the first time he flees, he's absolutely terrified because he finds out the murder happens, this thing is known, and he runs in fear of his life. The second time they leave, the Egyptians are begging them and kicking them out of the land, so there's no wrath to be feared. They're like, get out of here. They're afraid of the Israelites at this point. So which one is it? Think about that. We'll talk about it next week.